So I think, other than to say thank you to our colleagues from Strathclyde, who particularly managed to find funding to facilitate this piece of research and are coming today to talk to us all about that around this event. So I'll now hand over to Jen, who can explain more to you. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. It's really nice to see you all. Yeah, I'm one of the co-investigators on the project with Darren, who's also on the call. So we put in the application having met with Sally. I think that's Darren waving. And then Rose has been the Knowledge Exchange Associate on the project and has been doing absolutely loads of work since the application went in. So we submitted a proposal in collaboration with Sally for some funding in the university, essentially to meet 3 central objectives. And they were we hoped to facilitate or help establish a cost of living working group made up of researchers and GCVS stakeholders. Ideally, to create a platform by which organisations throughout Glasgow could share information and avoid replicating labour or oversubscription to the same funding pots. And we'll talk about that later, because that was quite an ambitious objective, and one that we'd quite happily admit that we haven't quite met and would be interested to get feedback and guidance on. And a third objective was to launch a small ongoing study and development project that collects and disseminates high quality data from a range of GCVS stakeholders on the cost of living crisis. So that's what Rose has been doing, collecting data on how the cost of living crisis is impacting on frontline services and the support that they offer in the third sector. So that's where we are. We put the project in. We were very lucky to get some knowledge exchange funding from the university to support Rose in doing that data collection. And now the plan is to try and build on that, access further funding, develop further research opportunities. And that's mostly what today is about. We're aware that because there's quite a few people and in and out of breakout rooms and time might be quite tight, that not everyone will get a chance to speak, or might not want to speak, or might want to be anonymous. So we've provided a Padlet. So that's what myself and Fran have just put in the chat down the side. So you should be able to see a QR code or a link. If not, don't worry, I'll send it out again. And you can opt in if you'd like. You don't have to. You can either use your laptop and use the link and open up a tab, which will show you a notice board that has 3 columns on it. And the columns say cost of living, ongoing communications, future research topics, and any other thoughts. So actually that's 4 columns. I can't count. That's a great start. And if you want to, you can press one of the plus signs underneath one of those columns, or in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen that comes up if you follow the link, and you can add any of your thoughts on those topics, and you can add them anonymously if you want to. Alternatively, if you like, you can hold up your smartphone, take a picture of that QR code, and use that link through your phone so it's not open on a tab. So either way, if you'd like to engage that way, you prefer to do it anonymously or through writing, that's fine. And we're going to leave that open for approximately a month, so don't feel you've got to fill it in today. If you have any ideas after this that come to you, feel free to use the link again and we'll share it after the event, and you can keep adding to it. I'm aware that we want to keep to time, so that's me done. Is there anything you wanted to add, Darren or Rose? Fab. Well, in that case, I think I can pass along to Ian to talk about worker intensification, which is one of the sort of main themes of our project so far.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Okay. Yeah, I'll just get my slides up if that's okay.
Ian, I just thought I didn't actually introduce you. Ian is the head of our department. It's Professor Ian Cunningham, who is an expert on work intensification, and that's why we're inviting him to speak. We haven't just dragged him off the street. Sorry about that.
You did. You pulled me in, Jen. You pulled me in. You said, "Get on with it." Okay. Yeah, sorry. As Jen said, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on work intensification, and I've done research in the non-profit sector for a number of years around employment issues in largely social care organisations, but other providers of services from the kind of non-profit voluntary sector, and a lot of it's been focused in Scotland. And I suppose I think in line with the project, the impact of the cost of living crisis, I get kind of deja vu in a sense, because I've done stuff on the impact of austerity, the impact of retendering, the impact of personalisation, and they all add up to the same thing. People have to work harder for poor pay, in the sector. That's my overall general impression. And what I wanted to do is just highlight some of the kind of, I think, kind of ongoing themes that organisations and their workforces face in this kind of marketised system of kind of service provision or public service provision that many of you work under, or, you know, indeed, if you're not directly funded by, let's say, kind of government funders, you know, times are hard with those, you know, being funded by grants from other bodies, because we're all sort of facing the cost of living crisis, or some to varying degrees the cost of living crisis. So I was really pleased that Rose asked me to kind of come along and say something about this, and I'm sure Rose will cover some of this. But we have, I think, a unique set of circumstances facing the sector, not just in Glasgow, but more broadly, in terms of a cost of living crisis. You know, rising inflation, leading to not only amongst the people who you work with in terms of providing services, but also amongst your workforce, increasing fuel costs, increasing food costs. And I think this is perhaps one of the most pronounced crises that the sector's faced for some time, on top of, I would say, waves of crisis that kind of hit the sector at various points. I think largely from about 2000, largely since about 2000, I would say. There's some talk about a very good, you know, there was a season during the era of New Labour that, you know, led to some quite decent sort of funding packages across the sector. But let's be honest, there was strings tied to that, and there was never enough to actually meet the demands of the client base, because as funding increases, need increases, and the funding never matches the need. And this has quite significant issues or impacts, not only on services, but also on the workforce, and how the workforce actually does or undertakes the tasks that's kind of allocated to it once contracts are signed and once job descriptions are outlined and people take jobs in the sector. And one of the phenomenon, I think, that's kind of come up across, you know, and as I said, I've been studying this for quite a while, and one of the phenomenon that's always kind of popped up during these crises is this concept of work intensification. In other words, requirements on the workforce to do more with less or more with the same, and how this then manifests itself in the organisation of work. And certainly, I think we can take kind of two or three kind of broad understanding of how this kind of impacts on the workforce. And we see three levels: increases in the pace of work, increases in the volume of work, and increases in the level of work. In other words, the final one being when organisations are forced with kind of demands for or increasing costs, as in the current kind of crisis, or demands to do more with less, they mess around or play around with the skill mix and the grades of workers. You know, so we see workers taking on more responsibility compared to what they used to do, and it could be linked to the responsibilities of a higher grade, let's say a support worker, a senior support worker, or even a team leader. But we'll come to that later. But what I wanted to do is just kind of give you my experience of how this kind of plays out for workers and has played out. They say, what's new about austerity? That was the slogan, I think, that the third sector gave us about 10 years ago. And I would say what is new about work intensification, because it's always been there as organisations are faced with increasing demands for more efficient use of resources and a more efficient use of the public purse. So what organisations increasingly find they have to do is increase the pace of work. In other words, make workers work faster, to take on ever more service users, clients, customers, and the language of that has changed quite considerably since I've been studying the non-profit voluntary sector. But the pace of work can be altered by a number of means. It could be just done in the kind of very traditional way of your line manager upping the number of clients that you have, and then ensuring through ways and means that you attend work and you actually fill in timesheets and paper records, etc., to basically record that work has been done. But we've also seen the increasing use of electronic monitoring and surveillance of the workforce. Many organisations have found that certainly the larger ones, the kind of clocking in and clocking out of people's residences, and the most notorious examples of this, as we know, are in long-term elderly care, not necessarily an area where the voluntary sector is most active. That's more kind of independent private organisations. But certainly these devices, where you have your phone or your tablet and you walk into somebody's house and you show a QR code or whatever to a monitor. This is about ensuring that the discipline of time is kept to, because time is one of the key kind of, if you like, defining features, and the management of time is one of the key defining features of care work in whatever kind of format and whatever client group it faces. The ability to see as many clients as possible in as short a time as possible. And at its worst, this is the notorious 15-minute visits to clients where very little kind of social interaction is provided. If anybody kind of steps out that 15 minutes, it's recorded through electronic means, and that work goes unpaid. If they go out too early, that is again recorded, and the local authority or any other funder can actually claim that money back for time not actually spent directly with the service user. And the pace of this is can be quite intense. You've seen examples of workers in quite diverse geographical areas kind of having to dart around different people's homes, etc. And this really takes away, I think, a lot of the relational work that the sector is characterized by. That kind of like being not only a carer, but also a point of contact for very vulnerable people to be able to interact with and have some form of social relation with. And in some cases, it may be the fact that that person is the only person they see in that day, or certainly for long stretches of the day. But what work intensification does, and the demand for more efficiencies does, is undermine that quality of care by quickening the pace. And as I said, I've looked at various levels of care work, and it's not just this kind of domiciliary care. It can be the social worker with unmanageable workloads. I remember going into a unit of that was to do with drugs and alcohol, and a newly qualified social worker on their first day being given something like 60 clients to look after, and then it went up to 100. And again, largely because of this demand for efficiencies, but also, as we're seeing increasingly, the increase in problems of recruitment and retention. So the pace of work is also linked to the volume of work. Again, funders demanding more for less, and this can be again played out by organisations in different ways. It can lead to some organisations not being able to, or practically responding to shortages of funding by not replacing posts. And what does that mean? That means that those left are left with somebody else's job to absorb and pick up. So the work effort bargain sometimes can mean that one person picks up another half job, another full job. I remember doing a focus group a number of years ago in a provider, and it was actually an administration worker. It wasn't a frontline carer, but just suddenly in this focus group, bursting into tears because she described how she'd had to take on the roles of 2 other people who had left and not been replaced, and that this was becoming completely unmanageable. Yeah, completely unmanageable, very emotional. So this kind of volume of work is an important way of understanding how work intensification occurs. Non-replacement of posts, people on absence, long-term absence, short-term absence. Again, either on a long-term or short-term basis, workers having to pick up the tasks of others because there was insufficient resources to fund replacements. So again, volume of work is important. And I remember years ago, my colleague, and just bear with me a sec, if I kind of just broaden this out a little bit. You know, this isn't a UK phenomenon. It's not a Scottish phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. This happens right across care facilities, care systems in most countries across the globe for one reason or another, but largely due to this kind of ongoing increase in costs, organisations making savings. And my friend Donna Baines from Canada, you know, in the very early years of kind of exploring care from an academic point of view, made this point about it's never enough. This need is never met. The resources are never met. So what workers do is fill in the gaps. You know, so they'll work through breaks, they'll work through lunch, they'll take on extra time at the end of the day, because as they say, it's not a 9-to-5 job. You can't just walk out the door and leave somebody in crisis. And again, this speaks to the shortage of resources. There are not enough workers. You know, there's not enough capacity in the system to meet this ever-growing need. So the volume of work is always there. The third level is the increase in the level of work. Again, as organisations struggle to meet demands for efficiencies, austerity, cost of living, etc., they become creative in trying to kind of again get the job done, and they look at various grades of staff, or they have historically looked at various grades of staff, and decided that it's no longer tenable to have, for example, senior support workers. And years ago, it used to be the differentiation between support workers and senior support workers, or support workers and support assistants. Many organisations went through a kind of restructuring a number of years ago that said, what we'll do is we'll just dilute the content of various teams, the makeup of various teams, and bring in lower graded workers, support assistants. And organisations would have to go through great lengths to, you know, in the contract of employment, to make a, you know, quite a distinct differentiation between these grades. But what you had was a blurring, once these become operationalised, a blurring of these boundaries between these grades, where the lower level support assistant would pick up the work of the support worker. Likewise, the support worker would pick up the work of the senior support worker. So as senior, better paid jobs were stripped away, lower paid workers were put in place and had to take on the responsibility. And again, this has been the direct result of demands for cost savings. You know, pretty much what I think what Rose's study is going to be shown as we move forward. So, and this can be played out also in terms of the frontline worker and the team leader. Team leaders are becoming increasingly scarce. Their spans of control are increasing. They're not just managing one project, but 2 or 3. And as this progresses, again, workers are having to pick up the tasks that were previously the responsibility of a higher level of grade. And in this case, it is the team leader. And digitalization is, if you like, aggravating this, as workers are encouraged to fill out reports, do records in similar ways that team leaders do. But you know, that responsibility is now being devolved down to the front line. So without further ado, I think it's useful to consider, I think, how these types of, if you like, or forms of work intensification are now playing out in this latest crisis, the cost of living crisis. And that's me.
Wow, thanks, Ian. That's a fairly sobering thought, most of what you presented, but I'm sure many of us are going to recognise an awful lot of what's going on in all of that. So it'll be interesting to now hear from Rose. I think we're taking questions afterwards. Is that right, Rose?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I do have to sort of head off, I think, by about 1:15. Is that possible?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay.
Okay, so okay, you don't need to see my emails. You think I would be able to do this now after all of this time, but here we go. So it's been a really interesting talk. Thank you, Ian. And it does really feed into a lot of the findings that I've found from the focus groups that I've been conducting. So again, same kind of background slide, so I'll not talk through so much of that, but what I'll say is I've conducted 3 focus groups, and it's generally been people at kind of a more management level, because we've been looking more particularly at this impact on organisations rather than individuals. And there's been a whole load of different sectors who've input into this. So there's been people who are supporting people with debt advice, people who are supporting refugees and people seeking asylum, and people working in children and families, people working in mental health. So quite a range of kind of things from the third sector. And again, I've just got kind of Ian's slide in here. So just as a sort of a reminder of these are some of the things which you'll see coming out of the findings. Okay, so one of the big findings, which won't be a massive shock to anyone, I don't think any of these findings will, but is that there are issues with funding at the moment. So, you know, funding is generally short term and it's often been frozen or it's been cut. And, you know, that's causing obviously a lot of issues. People are having to apply for multiple funding pots, and they're not necessarily as successful in as many of them as there would be previously. So we've got a quote here saying, you know, that the funding pots, they're oversubscribed. And even in cases where people might have secure funding, it's just not enough anymore because of, you know, the inflation, these rises in all of the prices across everything. So what was potentially enough is not going to be enough anymore. And this is also, you know, in terms of frozen pots of funding, often something is trying to be run on the same funding that was allocated 5 years ago, say. And I did do some quick having a little bit of a look, and if you had £100, just as an illustration, 5 years ago, that should be £121.67 now. So obviously that's a very relatively small amount when we're talking about running services. So you can see that that shortfall is just absolutely huge. And like I say, that's problems with all of these increased costs. Building costs have gone up, travel costs, and then of course there is the impact of the personal costs that staff and volunteers themselves are facing as well. So I think it was something that came up quite a few times was actually this talk about building costs. And there's this quote here that you can see, you know, if you own a building, that was going to give you something better, it was going to give you some kind of sustainable income stream. But actually that's not now the case, because those costs have risen so much that now a building is often actually almost a drain on what's going on with people. So now people are having to think, do we keep this building? Do we sell it to try and, you know, make some money back? They have to think about how they use that building. And I think one interesting thing was somebody said, you know, we might have previously rented it out really cheap to run children's parties or whatever. And now instead we're having to go for the bigger kind of, you know, bigger classes where people might pay a bit more money to actually hire the room for that. So, you know, those are kind of knock-on effects on the community as well, which don't help in when everybody is struggling with this crisis, this cost of living. The increased costs in terms of like the personal costs for staff and for volunteers, obviously that's sometimes led to people having to move jobs, but even for a relatively small pay rise, because that will help them. And also volunteers potentially have less time to volunteer because they're having to work more paid hours. And so that idea of staff leaving feeds into this recruitment and retention issues that came up a lot. So obviously there's issues, this kind of encompasses everything. So the short-term funding gives people precarious contracts. And you can see here, there's a quote from somebody saying, you know, there might be a really attractive piece of work, but it's a short-term contract. So they move on because they get a permanent contract, and it doesn't matter what that permanent contract is. So often people were talking about people leaving for less fulfilling work, less interesting work, things that they didn't necessarily want to do, but they needed that permanent contract, or they needed that small pay rise. And then again, obviously that's a further knock-on effect, isn't it? If people are leaving before the end of short-term contracts, as Ian was talking about there, somebody's going to have to pick up that work. And, you know, you're talking by that point, you've got an even shorter short-term contract that's left available. So it's not very desirable. People are less likely to even want to go through that process of actually even advertising that, because that's expense in itself. Recruiting somebody is expense in itself. So somebody has to pick up that work. There was some talk about, you know, potentially lower wages within the sector than there might be in, say, the public sector. And obviously, again, that can have an impact on making these jobs more attractive or people being able to be recruited. Whereas this is a sector where, you know, people talked a lot about how people are really engaged with their work. You know, they do it because they want to do that type of work. But at the moment, there is, as I said, that conflict where people need to earn enough for themselves to be able to live and absorb those additional costs in their personal lives. Within Glasgow, some people talked about, you know, you're all recruiting and all pulling from that same group of workers, that same pool of people. And obviously, again, the public sector within Glasgow are pulling from that same pool of workers as well. So that can be, you know, cause some kinds of issues. And there was some talk as well about people being more prepared to move jobs. Whereas, you know, that people talked about in terms of kind of less loyalty, although that was understandable because they understood why people might be moving on in terms of those money and that kind of thing. In terms of the kind of services that people are actually offering, people are coming into the services with more complex needs than they previously had. So that's the people accessing the services. And some of that's obviously from the impacts of, you know, austerity, COVID, pandemic, and the cost of living on their personal lives, which is, you know, made those needs, like I say, more complex, more bigger. And there's also, as we all know, been increases in statutory sector waiting lists and cuts in those services, which means that, you know, more people with more complex needs are now accessing the third sector. So this actually adds to that workload that everybody has. And also, you know, that's so the individual who is, you know, say dealing with a person, helping a person, supporting a person, they're now dealing with an increased workload in terms of trying to deal with that more complex needs. And then on top of that, for the organisations, that has meant that there's more pastoral support required for staff to help them to deal with these, you know, often really difficult emotional kind of situations that they're hearing about. And on top of this, staff are already talking about they're already burnt out following pandemic responses, because the third sector was particularly pulled upon during the pandemic to support people and to provide things when actually a lot of statutory sectors in fact closed. So there's already, you know, this kind of people have dealt with going through austerity, they've gone through COVID, and now there's this cost of living crisis. So you can see here, this was a quote about somebody saying we've not had any time to recover, you know, following our pandemic responses in terms of well-being and energy and demand on the third sector. And now that energy and that demand is still increasing and still ramping up. I wanted to say something positive because I do feel that there are positive things going on, and, you know, amongst the kind of doom and gloom. So people, I mean, it was, like I say, the flexibility, the creativity within the sector was really on show. And that was fantastic. And people were really proud to work within the sector and to work in this way. And there are, you know, various things that organisations are trying to do to make it more attractive as well. So some people talked about moving down to 4-day weeks, but with full pay. They were talking about hybrid working options, which obviously helps to then mitigate some of that increase in costs that people have in attending work, as well as kind of links to career progression. It was an interesting kind of contrast. So I've put this into my solutions, but often they were talking about early intervention services were one of the first things that are being cut, because that's just kind of the way it's going, so that people can try and, you know, spread that money to the more in need, or what's seen as being more in need. But some services are actually, instead of completely cutting that, they're offering a sort of an interim support. So it's like a less intensive early intervention, but that's to try and hold people over and help people until they can access the more sort of more intensive, it might be more intensive counselling services, for example. There's also changing models of working, and again, I think this probably has positives and negatives, but moving more towards digital in some things, which, you know, can be really supportive in terms of, like I said, under hybrid working, you know, people don't have to spend as much to get into work, or if people are accessing services, they might not have to spend money to physically get there. But obviously we know that that can have its downsides as well, what with, you know, thinking about digital inclusion. So I've put it in solutions, but I do appreciate that there were positives and negatives that kind of came out of that. Some organisations are providing expenses to volunteers up front rather than that claiming back. And again, that's to try and mitigate some of those issues that people themselves are having with their own personal costs, and to encourage volunteers, you know, into the sector, because it's very important and it's very needed. So again, this flexibility and this creativity of the sector really hit me. It was really amazing. And I think, you know, this quote here, which talks about how do we showcase that work? You know, there's this amazing work that's going on across the whole of the third sector. And there's really individualized work with people and with communities. And, you know, it's a really exciting place to be in and to work. So I do think that that's important. And I think that, you know, perhaps some of that showcasing needs to go on in order to help with some of the recruitment and retention issues. But again, it's where do you prioritize that? And people did say that as well, you know, is it almost frivolous to be talking about how amazing we are when, you know, we know there's so much going on and so many issues. And I think the final, really, this was the take home kind of big message overall, is these impacts do ripple up and down the system. And you know, somebody actually talked about it like this, with it being the knock-on effect all the way through. So you've got the person who's coming into an organisation who is requiring that more intensive support. You've got the person who it connects with them, who's then, you know, putting potentially more emotional labour into something because it's a really, you know, a really tricky situation. It's a really complex issue. You've got the person who manages that person, who's then supporting them and providing that pastoral support. And that's an increased sort of load at the moment. And then managers as well are talking about, you know, spending most of their day trying to make things balance and make the budget balance because of all of these increased costs. And there's a lot to worry about. And then, yeah, so you've got this all the way through the process, more support needed. So like I say, I think that's probably the big main take home message that I think everybody should kind of know. And again, I don't think it's probably surprising to any of you. You probably all do know this, but I think it's quite good to get it down in a kind of a research context, and we will obviously be writing about this and talking about it. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation now, and we are open for some questions if people have them. We're going to probably split out into 2 breakout rooms, but if there's any burning questions that you want me, as the person who conducted those focus groups, to answer now while we're all together, that's fine. You can also email me. You can put something on the Padlet if you want, put something into the chat. But if there's nothing that's burning and coming up right now, then we'll probably split into our two rooms. And
Rose, can I ask a quick question of Ian, because Ian's got to go? I was just wondering, Ian, if there was any acknowledgement from sort of public sector or funders and any mitigations for any of this. Is there any acknowledgement about this worker intensification, and are funders or public sector trying to do anything to support?
Probably not, no. I think you know, through sort of ways and means, they've kind of encouraged this, and public sector funders would kind of take a hands off. You know, it's not my responsibility. Like in any supply chain, the head of the supply chain kind of passes down the income, and then it, you know, then stands away from that employment relation, the subsequent employment relationships. And you know, would in some cases act with some degree of surprise that this happens, or certainly a number of years ago used to do that. But also never underestimate the fact that when this was outsourced, it was all about saving costs on labour. It was a non-unionised sector where it was largely cheaper and could be made to be more cheaper, because the unions are not there to kind of make a stand and say we're not having this. So the whole agenda has been about cost cutting and cost saving, and yeah. So I would say no. I think where, for example, safety comes into play, where you've had extreme examples of handing back contracts and vulnerable people being left up in the air. I think it kind of strikes home then. It hits home then. And to a certain extent, it's hitting home in the current recruitment and retention crisis, but you know, it's not big on their radar, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
They assume it will be done because of the goodwill amongst the workforce.
It's a fairly sad picture, but thank you.
I would say, just to add to that, within this sector itself, people are definitely trying to address some of that, and there is a big realization that, you know, what's being asked of staff and volunteers is a big ask. And I do feel like like I say, this creativity within the sector that people have talked about a lot, you know, people are trying. I mean, that doesn't help obviously in terms of the funders appreciating it, but it is something slightly positive just amongst that doom and gloom. So I haven't seen any questions coming up in the chat or anything. So what I'm going to do is split us, I think now, well, Fran's going to very kindly split us into our two groups, and we'll say bye to Ian. And thank you very much, Ian. It was very, very good talk.
Bye-bye.
Very helpful.
Bye.
Okay, everybody. Did we want to do just a quick debrief of that session, and then we'll have a comfort break for 10 minutes? Is that okay? Yeah, I'm happy to just discuss what was mentioned in my session. So we had some really good discussions from Firdaus and from Tracy and Rose, and it seems to me the kind of key issue here is recruitment and retention, and I guess attraction of volunteers and of staff. One of the major issues was, well, the cost of living crisis was impacting on Firdaus's homework club, because people couldn't basically afford to go and do the voluntary work in the community. So for me, it really highlights an issue attached to community inequalities that are being exacerbated by this cost of living crisis. And I think that was really important. Tracy from Volunteer Glasgow, hope you don't mind me name checking you there, Tracy, has come back from mat leave to a situation where it's really difficult to get the right people in the right jobs. People leave because pay isn't great and the contracts are short term, from what I understand. So there is a kind of recruitment crisis there as well. And she interestingly mentioned this kind of, there's a huge demand for voluntary time, but actually there's not the same labour supply that potentially there used to be. So there's this really big mismatch, and it's at crisis level. So the more that we can do about that, the better. One really positive thing that I learned about was GCVS's, is it 32-hour week? Which is probably not good for Sally's mental health, but it is good for people on the front line delivering services, people who are maybe not on managerial levels to the same extent. It does provide that flexibility. So something for the sector potentially to think about. Was there anything else? I'm sorry, there was a lot going on in that session there. I don't think I've captured everything, but was there anything else that anybody wanted to share, or anything that came back from that? I think the point was that a lot of what was being mentioned by Rose really resonated with the group, but have I missed anything? Have I captured everything that was mentioned?
The only other thing I noticed was that there was Rose from the other talked about her ethnic minority group, and all of the findings resonated, but she was pleased that we'd put some time into actually writing it down as a piece of research that we could share.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rose. And we're happy to, just as a kind of general point, we'll go into this discussion, but the university is happy to support and to have conversations with GCVS as well about some of these issues, to see whether there's anything that we can help about. Is there a problem in your organisation that you're facing? Well, we might be able to help you apply for some minor or slightly bigger funds to have a look at that, or to support some development work around the issue. So lots to discuss. Jen, did you want the feedback from your session, or?
I must admit it was largely Rose's session. I just immediately handed over responsibility to Rose, but we mostly focused on solutions, and that actually what our research has sort of come up with is not necessarily solutions based. And then we talked about the larger under-resourcing issues with the sector more widely. So we had a sort of a slightly separate chat really about how to engage in research that comes up with solutions. But then, I mean, that talk started to turn into how we might map where the people are doubling up, or where someone's complex needs can be better addressed by another agency or another organisation, and how we'd signpost and all that. So it was a really interesting chat, but we were definitely focusing more on the issues with the lack of resourcing and in the whole sector, and not being able to find answers because they're not necessarily available because of the lack of resources.
Okay, well, that sounds very positive, very constructive. Does anybody else have anything you would like to add before we take a 10-minute break? Is that right? I'm on track here. Well, we're slightly off track, but I'm on track just with the general programme, I think. Yeah, 10-minute comfort break. So maybe come back at, yes, Firdaus. You're on mute.
So since you're from the universities, we're thinking perhaps of doing like perhaps partnership working with higher education institution to refer people to organizations, to refer learners or your students to organizations where they can do their work placement as part of their credits. In that way, we don't have to be gambling to look for volunteers who cannot commit. We would like, if we had that partnership, we'll be able to have a consistent service for our service users. Yeah.
Okay, well, we can, I mean, that's, that is something that Karen Morrison, my colleague here from Strathclyde University, hi Karen, Karen will be talking about placements and the things that are currently happening with GCVS, and I'm sure that we would be happy to have a chat with you about that too. So we will be definitely having a focused chat about that after the break, if that's okay. So if there's no more questions, will we come back in 10 minutes? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. See you in 10. Bye.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome back, folks, from the break. It's been really interesting, if a little bit sobering thoughts this morning. We're moving on very slightly now to consider how we might work together for the future with the universities. So my opportunity to give a little bit of an input first. We're running slightly behind time, just very slightly, so I try and be fairly quick. So as you know already, my name's Sally Condy. I'm the head of sector development at GCVS. And before we go on to talk about those future collaborations and what we might do with the universities, I thought it would be useful to share some of the experience that we've had thus far, because there's been a fair bit that we've managed to try already, and I'm really excited about how we can move that on for the future. So I've got a presentation, it's only a cut of 3 slides, so I'll just share that with you now. I'm hoping it's coming. Can you see that? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yeah, thank you very much. So, as I said, you've come along to the session today, so I can probably assume that you're already somewhat signed up to the idea of working with academic colleagues. But I can tell you from a GCVS perspective, it's been a long-held aspiration of ours to make the most of the really excellent universities that we've got on our doorstep. We've been working with both Strathclyde and Glasgow University more recently, and in the past, other colleagues have worked with Glasgow Caledonian University, and we're really keen to see what we can do with that for the future. So to talk about some of what we have done and why we might do it, it's a sad fact that Glasgow has no shortage of what you might call those knotty problems, the multifaceted, complex issues that have impacted citizens in the city for generations. We've heard a lot today about the cost of living. Ian referred back to a time of austerity, and of course we know about the poverty and the health inequalities that are ever present. It's just a fact that none of us in our organisations are on our own. Sorry about that, if you can hear my phone. None of us are going to, sorry, I can't stop it from ringing. There we are. None of us can fix these solutions on our own. So it's never been more important than to start trying to work together as we are now. So sharing knowledge across sectors to see what we can do, we benefit from all the different perspectives, and the perspectives that the academics bring for us for your organisations, if you like, they're not immediately part of your situation. So they bring that external view, that slightly fresh look at the problem that you have. And I already heard that beginning to happen in our workshop today, with Darren beginning to talk to people about their particular situations. The academic staff link into things like literature reviews. They make connections with other research for us from the UK and abroad. And we heard Ian referring to what happens in other countries and other places. So they are that respected external source of information and knowledge that can be really helpful. Staff and volunteers in the voluntary sector organisations have really valuable lived experience, and they're often quite happy to tell their stories, especially if they think it's going to help somebody else. I mean, sometimes we're a competitive sector, but very much that most of the time we want to work together and see what we can do. Finding ways to get our voices heard that can make a difference is really valuable, and academics, I think, are an excellent route to doing that. And we know from academic colleagues here today that it's essential to get those genuine voices into good quality academic research. It has to be said that funders also like it if you can mention that a funding application is based on some external independent research. So getting our voices heard can be a really important factor in this. By working together, we can build up our collective knowledge of what works and what doesn't work, and sometimes what we need to look at next. So in this way, we can find examples of good practice from the research and share that with other organisations. And I mentioned already times when resources are stretched, finding out from others' research what's worked and what hasn't is really important. So that ability to be able to network and share the findings with each other is really important. And lastly, from my point of view, I wanted to mention something that's just started, but that has great potential, shaping the priorities. I know that Darren's going to say more about this, but through working together, voluntary sector organisations might actually be able to shape some of the choices about what research is undertaken. So to give you an example, GCVS mentioned to Darren during last year that we thought there was a real need to find out about the impact of the cost of living on the voluntary sector. We were all talking about it, but we wanted to actually do some research. And as you've heard, Darren, Jen and the colleagues were able to access funding for us from the Strathclyde Business School Knowledge Exchange Fund. And that's paid for Rose to be able to undertake the research. And here we are today. So by working together, highlighting the need to our academic colleagues, they were fortunate enough to be able to find some funding to take this work forward. Now, it's not always easy and we don't underestimate that, but I think even the potential to be able to have that conversation and know that in the future we might be able to shape some priorities together is really, really exciting. And so sometimes it's a good idea, you know that something's a good idea in principle, but you don't quite know how to do it in practice. And I thought that might come up today if we're talking sort of generally about things. It's hard to get your head around what that might actually be and what sorts of things could working with the universities actually mean. So it's a very busy slide, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the examples of how we've already worked with the universities. But please don't be limited to this when we get to the discussions. We want the new ideas as well. So GCVS started this work in around 2021 on a piece of work called The Collaborative with Policy Scotland and the University of Glasgow, where we offered opportunities for students from the School of Social Sciences to do their dissertations on collaborative work with the voluntary sector organisations. We didn't get a lot of uptake at that stage, but the university also provided some training to voluntary sector organisations on topics that we were interested in, such as risk management. And more importantly, we started to build those relationships. And even though that project's no longer funded, we still have those contacts. We still keep in touch with each other and share opportunities when they come up. And it's worth noting that already I'm talking about working with academics and also students at various levels, depending on what the project is. So with Strathclyde University, we started our work and all recognised the really early value of having a sort of charter or partnership agreement in place to help GCVS and the university set out that we're willing to work with each other and also put a bit of a framework around that. It's focused on, as you've heard today, the Department of Work, Employment and Organisation in the Strathclyde Business School. And this gives you a clue to some of the other topics that you might want to think about that could be relevant. So employment relations, human resource management, organisational behaviours, those sorts of things. So we've progressed all of these opportunities that you've heard about. You can see on the slides today, and you've seen an example in action, having academics come to speak to us, guest speakers promoting their relevant research. Ian spoke today about worker intensification. Rose spoke about the cost of living findings. Ian's previously spoken about use of digital technology in care organisations, and I know some organisations picked up contacts with him afterwards. So these are examples of the academic staff coming along to share research with the sector. And for myself, I've tried in the past to search for relevant research and read it up, and it's not always very easy. So having access to experts that will actually not only come and speak to you, but happy to have a conversation and talk to you afterwards is really, really meaningful, I think. It helps to make that link much stronger. University staff are also always really willing to reach out to other colleagues. You know, several times they've said to me, I don't know, but I'll find you somebody who does. I'll get you somebody else that you can speak to in a relevant department. So it's really valuable to have that direct link with the people that are undertaking the research. So I guess one of our most popular opportunities at the minute that we've trialled that we could think about repeating was voluntary sector groups being case studies for an undergraduate course. In this particular case, it was around marketing and communications. So voluntary sector organisations submitted a very short form explaining what their problem or challenge was, and it was round things like needing to market a new service or not knowing how to communicate with their service users, that type of thing. And 2 of those were selected by the students to undertake work on as part of their course. In return, eventually the group received a whole collection of ideas from all the students, and one was lucky enough to be funded by the university to take their idea all the way to fruition, and they had an internship over the summer to work with the voluntary sector group. That's an opportunity that we're running again this academic year, and we hope to repeat again in the future. GCVS ourselves are hosting a couple of MBA students this summertime looking at sustainability projects, and another number of organisations are also doing that as well. These students have a contact member of staff, and we facilitate visits for them over a sort of 6 or 8 week period in the summertime, but they're mostly working remotely just with a regular check-in. These summer projects this year are about changing behaviours and how you measure sustainability. So these are just a couple of the examples that we've had before. There've also been examples of how we've raised awareness together. So Karen's going to tell you a bit more about her engagement work from the university perspective, and GCVS staff have been out to various groups of students highlighting opportunities around work, around placements and employment in the voluntary sector. So it might not immediately provide something, but it's raising that awareness of working in the voluntary sector and how that might be opportunities for students in the future. And lastly, if funding permits, then very occasionally we find some money to actually commission research directly. And just at the moment, GCVS is commissioning a piece of work around fair work with the Scottish Centre for Employment Research at Strathclyde University. So they're the types of work we've done in the past. And my very last slide is just to say to you, if you've been on any of my training in the past around measuring impact, you'll know that I always suggest we ask the so what question. Well, so what? So what as a result of all that? Well, we've learned quite a few lessons as a result of doing this, and I'd like to just mention them very briefly because I think some of them are worth actually taking forward with us, and they're worth you bearing in mind when you're starting to think about the opportunities you would like to suggest get taken up. So the first one is probably the most important. Both sectors have their own times and timescales and rhythms, so things take time. So be prepared for this. Suggestions for research work are best if it's not the most urgent thing you need right now, but that it's very useful, say in 6 months' time, or if it's an idea you have, but your organisation just doesn't have the resource to devote to it. A sort of, well, if we could, and that's the sort of thing where maybe a student could come along and would be interested to undertake that piece of work. So as an example, sorry, I've lost myself there. We've just gathered proposals for the marketing course, as I mentioned, and the students will work on that in September, October time, and the ideas will come back to the organisations involved by the end of the year, say Christmas time. If the student's funded to fully complete that piece of work, it won't be till next summer. So that could have taken a year in total. So the project, the organisation might well get something really useful out of it, but it doesn't help their immediate problem just now. The 2 MBA students that I mentioned, their work is around 2 or 3 months, so it can be a little bit quicker. So it's worth bearing in mind that the university staff and students can't fill an exact gap that you necessarily have. We can't recruit staff, so we want to find a student. It doesn't exactly work like that. But maybe the academic staff or the students can help you thinking about restructuring work in a different way. Can they take on other tasks? Can they look at some other things for you to find a different solution? And we all know that every workplace has their own processes and language and assumptions that we take for granted. And it took us a while from GCVS and the universities to figure that all out, to actually navigate our way around. and colleagues were really helpful in, as I said already, finding the right people in the university for us to talk to, but also to explain some of their language. And we've tried to help the universities engage better with the 4,500 voluntary sector organisations there are in Glasgow. It takes a bit of time sometimes to get that working, and GCVS staff still help with that role by helping organisations develop their proposals, fill out forms, get information into the sort of format that academic staff might actually need for their processes. So you should hopefully sense from some of my examples that we're really building the trust and relationships. So even if the current staff move on, these sort of professional relationships should now continue and begin to grow. And for a while, we struggled with the idea that this was so big, how were we going to do something about it? But as the old adage goes, we were eating an elephant one bite at a time. And that's actually okay. We started somewhere. We tried some of these things that were small, and now we're building it and we're looking to expand. So if you've got an idea that you think, oh, that's too small, don't mention it. Please don't be put off from asking, because it might be the start of something, or it might chime with some other people that have also got that interest, and perhaps we can do something together. Or there might just be an academic somewhere that was really interested in that particular thing that you wanted to explore a bit more. So we are looking to expand all these things, and we'd like to share it with the sector as a whole. And we do share it. Hopefully you've seen our newsletters and the GCVS website, but it's much more challenging to do that on a two-way communication. How do we get your ideas and gather those together? And we've tried an email, we've tried Mighty Networks, which is a bit like Facebook, we've tried Slack, but as Darren mentioned earlier, we haven't quite cracked that bit yet, and we certainly do want to see what everybody thinks around that. So to end my input, I really just wanted to say thank you to all the colleagues here, and really pleased to hear the next bit of the sort of conversation, which is handing over to Rose and Karen to talk about this working together from the university perspective.
Thank you, Sally. That was really great. And, you know, really, it does touch on some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So I haven't prepared any slides for this bit because I just kind of wanted to talk to you all about it. So it's been fantastic working with GCVS on this project. You know, particularly Sally has helped to kind of shape this project to make it, you know, so even beyond the point of getting the funding, when we've actually started on the data collection, she's really helped to shape it and give it a good focus, something that's much more relevant to the voluntary sector. And that's something that I'm really passionate about in research, is getting those voices of the people who are actually involved in something to be part of it. I've mainly worked in health research in the past, and we tend to call it in health research PPI, but not that type of PPI that everybody missold. So it's patient and public involvement. And now there's often an E added on the end of that there for patient and public involvement and engagement. And I've been working in in the research sector for over 10 years. And it's been really interesting to see how that side of things, particularly in the health sector, has developed. So now you'll find that for example, the National Institute for Health Research have guidelines about how to involve people, about how to do it well, about how to value people's involvement. And that's not something that existed when I first started doing this type of work. So it's really great, and things move on. And I think, part of it is that, like Sally was saying, you've got to eat the elephant one bite at a time. So within this sector, we're just starting out in some ways. It's been going on, I would imagine, for a long time, but we're starting out to try and make that more formal, I suppose, almost, that collaboration, which is great. And this is a starting point. This is something that we hope to build on. It's so important to get the people who are actually involved. Like, we could have just gone off and done this, what's the impact of the cost of living crisis on the voluntary sector, as a university project, without Sally being so closely involved. It wouldn't have been as good. It wouldn't have been as relevant to what's actually happening within the sector. It wouldn't have been as relevant to your needs for that research information. And the data collection would have been much more tricky, because obviously, you know, even just from that sort of point of view, Sally has enabled those connections through GCVS for that to happen. So it works both ways. It's beneficial to us. It helps us to get our research actually done. It helps us to make it more relevant, more interesting. Funders really do like, so research funders really do like to see those kinds of partnerships. You know, as I was talking about health research there, you won't get big health research grants anymore without having some kind of public involvement. It just won't happen, which I think is really, you know, is really great. Obviously, we want to try and avoid that more kind of tokenistic involvement. But even if we're only starting out at a tokenistic involvement, as long as we can grow that, we can learn from that, and we can make it better as we go along, you know, I think it's a really good kind of starting point. Some people did talk about some of this stuff within the focus groups. So we talked about it, or less in terms of research, but people talked about, for example, local authorities come in and asking for some representation of a specific group or a specific organisation, a specific life experience, for example. And we talked about some of the issues that there are around that, you know, people being invited to meetings, turning up at these meetings, they haven't had sight of the paperwork necessarily before, but everybody else has. People are talking in 2 different languages, which Sally alluded to there as well. So that's something that's really important to think about and to overcome as well. And I think a lot of that is about just being open and being prepared to ask questions and being prepared to check understandings. People might sort of also turn up to these potentially local authority, could be other decision-making meetings, and in fact the decisions have already realistically been made, and it's just a tick box exercise. And that's something that I think we really want to avoid in our research and in our research partnership. I do think that if we're going to be involving people, they have to have a genuine say in it and have to be able to change things. So those are really, like I say, it's those really important areas. And one just quick example to finish on from my previous research work, we did a study about early therapy in perinatal stroke. So this is babies who've had a stroke in the womb. And this was the development of a particular type of therapy for those babies that's delivered by the parents in the home in the first 6 months of life. So, you know, a very sensitive topic, a very difficult area. All new parents are going to have a tough time when they first bring a new baby home, you know, even if they don't have these additional health problems. So it was a really tricky kind of project to get working on. And we worked with, at the early stages, we worked with parents of children who were a bit older, but who'd been through that process. We worked with occupational therapists, we worked with physiotherapists to shape the project and to make sure that this, so we ended up doing, it was a feasibility study of this particular type of therapy. And we shaped the way that therapy was delivered, based on feedback from parents and from the professionals, to make sure it was something that would actually fit into the daily life of, you know, a parent with a newborn baby, but also within the existing health services around occupational therapy and physiotherapy, for example. And if we hadn't have done that, there's various things like we didn't think about the fact that people might not always have digital inclusion, they might not have access to the internet. So we developed all these videos and this great website for this therapy. And then parents went, well, I don't have enough, you know, I only have internet on my phone, I don't have enough data plan for that. And so we changed the way we did it. So we offered that, but we also offered a DVD version of those videos. And we looked to offer an USB version. It wasn't feasible within that study, but I think it's something that, you know, potentially would be taken forwards. And also the way that we were designing some of the interactions with the health professionals just weren't feasible within the way the actual NHS works. So speaking to those health professionals helped us to reshape it and redesign it. And I just think that it made such a big difference to the overall project and to the final feasibility study, which we proved that this therapy was feasible. And then I have moved on now, but I know that the paediatrician involved is very much trying to take that forwards. But I just wanted to share that as an example, you know, a very small example of how a project could have gone really badly wrong and off the rails, because, you know, we didn't engage with services as they currently exist. We didn't engage with the realities of parents' lives. And I think that that applies across all kinds of research. So I'm going to pass you over now to Karen, just to have a little bit of a talk about some of the work she's been doing between GCVS and the university as well.
Thanks, Rose. So hi, I'm also from the University of Strathclyde, and my role here is to help link our MSc students with external organisations. So thanks to GCVS, they introduced me last year to a wide number of their members, and we now have some students doing projects with them. I can circulate examples, I'll do that later, of some example reports that have been sent to organisations from the third sector. So as I said, the students who I deal with are here for 1 year. They're studying HR, and part of their professional qualification is they have to engage with a live HR issue in an organisation. And that's why I'm talking to you guys this morning, because I want to introduce you to that idea of maybe hosting a student project in the future. So the main areas they focus on is anything HR, but it can help you prepare for a change or evaluate initiative, just something that's on an organisation's to-do list that's not time critical, but would be really beneficial to the organisation to just have this piece of work done. We've got a couple of starting points throughout the year, but the majority of students will start in working with an organisation around January, February time. So if you've got an idea of something that's, you just don't have the resources to tackle an HR project, whether it be, I'll give you some examples of the topics that they've covered. So for the third sector, so talent management, looking at retention and attraction, that was something that was mentioned just as I was joining the call. Reviewing all the HR policies, maybe looking at performance management or challenges associated with hybrid working. We've even had students look at how do you motivate volunteers. So this is all things that you might consider giving a student access to the organisation and just supporting them for a period of time. And in return, you will get a research report. So this engagement can be virtual or online, can take, no, virtual and online is the same. It can be virtual or on site. And it can be a minimum 8 to 10 weeks. So basically that's what I wanted to introduce you to today. Now, keep me right, Fran, Sally, last year about October time, we had a session solely on this where organisations interested came along to a chat. We probably spent about half an hour talking about this and going into more detail about the sort of examples and relevance of topics. So if there's demand, I would be happy to come back and chat to you about that. So
if I could jump in,
yeah,
Karen,
jump in, Sally.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's the topics that people may be thinking, oh, that's no good to me now. But actually, I know the organisations that came to the session with Karen last year definitely benefited from having that chat to think about, maybe we could get a student that could help us look at our, as Karen said, our volunteer promotional opportunities, or how we work with volunteers, or hybrid working, or those sorts of things. Yeah. And through coming and having a chat about that, they realised that the student wasn't going to fix their problem, but it would help give the organisation some other ideas that they could then progress. And then typically what organisations do is get that report then from the student, and it goes to the board or your committee, and it gives them something to think about for the organisation to what you can do to help out. And as I said, it always helps with funders if you're looking for money, if you can say, it's not just an idea we thought we had, but some external students actually really helped us with this. And I guess the other bit is that I've found as well that the academic staff that support the students have always been really, really helpful in supporting the whole process around that and helping you as an organisation make that connection. Sorry, I jumped in there, Karen.
No, that's okay. But I mean, it's more than a report because it has recommendations and a sort of draft implementation plan. So there is something valuable there to be able to take you to the next step.
I
And we actually
just-
did, oh, sorry, Darren, just
Oh,
before.
sorry, Karen, I'll let you finish.
Yeah, we did prepare the students who may have never been involved in third sector before or even considered it. So we did prepare them for these projects, and we had a colleague from GCVS, I think she's left now, Natasha. She came in and really did a 2-hour session with the students about HR in the third sector and all the challenges involved in that, and how to, what to be aware of, what the issues may be. Sorry, Darren, on you go.
No, that's okay. Just to add, I'm just making sure it's the integrative, the IDDR projects we're talking about. Is that right? Yes. So the IDDR projects contain the academic research, but obviously there is this report element, and this report element is supposed to be costed properly and implementable. So really realistic recommendations that will allow you to put that research into practice, basically. So it's quite a unique offering in as far as universities goes, but I just thought I would make that addition.
Yeah, and it's a two-way thing. So obviously the organisation benefits from getting this piece of research and something off their to-do list that would probably you maybe never got around to do. But the students, it's really helpful for the students because they're coming from a wide, variety of backgrounds, but it really does help them support it really helps you guys support their development of sort of work ready skills and just something different for on their CV. So I mean, you can fire questions in the chat, or I can circulate. I'll send Fran. Is Fran still on? Fran, is it okay if what I did before, send you the report and some further information with contact details?
Absolutely. I'll be
Thank
sending
you.
everything that we get mentioned today out to everybody that's here. So yeah, whatever you've got to add, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm up next. Are you sorted, Karen?
I'm sorted. So yeah, you'll have my email soon. So thanks for inviting me along.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. Bye bye.
Thanks, Karen. So I'm going to talk a wee bit more about the potential for future research collaboration, and I'll try not to double up on what's been mentioned. Oh, sorry, my door's slamming there. I'll try not to double up on what's been mentioned before. So I wanted to talk a bit specifically about working together, the need for something known as impact in academic research, and what this means for future potential collaborations between us, GCVS, and you, GCVS's broader network of members and voluntary organisations. As means of context, so we have a long-standing relations with GCVS, and various different things have happened over the years between Strathclyde and GCVS, but I think over the course of this year in particular, this has been really ramped up through the work of Rose Watson as the knowledge exchange researcher, and the goodwill of Sally and Ian and colleagues at GCVS. So this is funded by the Strathclyde Business School Knowledge Exchange Fund, which really tries to develop those links between academia and society, academia and the private sector, academia and public sector, just out there basically to share academic ideas. So this is so this project's building on the charter between GCVS and Strathclyde, as Sally mentioned. So this is how would I frame this? So it's the framework for the relationship, but it's basically a working kind of policy document that's the framework for our collaboration. Now, Sally's kind of spoken about that from GCVS's kind of point of view about that document, so I won't go into too much detail on that. But the way that we see that document is it's that this is a kind of what are our obligations to GCVS in this environment, and it's to provide advice, support with academic research, offer opportunity to provide inputs as lecturers or discussants, explore opportunities for joint research fundings on themes which are relevant to Strathclyde and GCVS and its network, and provide guest speakers to contribute to study programmes and events. So there's quite a lot going on there, but why do I mention this? Well, it's exploring opportunities for joint research and making connections and supporting the university with, I guess, equitable access to participants. That's really, really important. Also provides a platform for the voluntary sector, for individual causes and cases to shape research agendas in universities, which is, if you're thinking about decolonising the university and thinking about power in society, well, the voluntary sector can certainly help us with some of that. So this arrangement is a platform for engagement between GCVS, Strathclyde and the wider GCVS network. So there's lots of opportunities for new engagement and ongoing research impact. So in terms of what Karen said about the types of projects, you know, we are in the Department of Work, Employment and Organisation, but that's quite a broad group. And when you're thinking about topics, we're happy to link you with people across the business school as well. And the Scottish Centre for Employment Relations sits within our Department of Work, Employment Organisation too. So we're quite closely connected with those colleagues as well. So in terms of that engagement, so I've got a few list of things here that I thought, you know, just as kind of discussion points, you know, do you, for example, want to increase your research or funding capacity? Are you looking to evaluate your impact? There's quite a bit of work going on at the university just now to evaluate the impact of social enterprises, for example, beyond the kind of usual evaluation metrics. Is there a community you'd like to work with but aren't familiar with participatory action research methods? Are you about to implement change in an organisation but are worried about its impact and how that's going to bed in? Have you been thinking about board development but don't know where to start? Are you worried about equity and inclusion issues in selection and attraction? Obviously, it seems like attraction and selection and keeping people in organisations is a huge deal attached to the cost of living crisis. Is there a problem in the organisation that might require research to understand? And just going back to Sally's point here, it's maybe not an immediate issue that we can fix, but we can certainly take the time to have a chat with you to see what's possible. Would you like, you know, expert comment on a research report you're writing, for example? Well, we would be happy to provide that. More generally, are you interested in sharing your organisation's expertise in the form of a guest lecture at Strathclyde? We don't have large non-profit modules, but we do have aspects of organisation, aspects to do with learning and development, to do with HR, potentially even to do with strategy, that are relevant to organisations of all kinds. Okay, so we have a core of people who are really passionate and really interested in the voluntary sector and civil society at Strathclyde University, and I just wanted to highlight that. Another thing here is, you know, some organisations are sitting on lots of data. Now, there are ethical issues about the use of secondary data in organisations that need to be dealt with up front, but sometimes this data can be used, you know, you might have particular people accessing your service, you don't really know why that's the case. Could you think about a strategy to do something differently based on the data that you have? So it's about thinking about what resources you have at your fingertips to make your organisation a more flourishing place for workers and for people accessing the services too. This kind of arrangement it also allows the university to meet its aims and objectives, specifically on research impact. So with the voluntary sector contributing to the research agenda, you're helping the university contribute towards its really important ideas about research impact. So what is research impact? So this is the evidence effect on change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, policy or services, health, the environment, quality of life beyond academia. One of the big challenges that we face in academia is that we can do this beautiful work on theory, on frameworks, on research problems and so forth, but you give us the capacity to put that into practice, and that's absolutely vital. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. So, you know, research impact, it requires knowledge exchange, and that means it requires input from you and your capacity working in all these different organisations. We need you to do our research. It's as simple as that. And collaboration between universities and partner organisations to deliver commercial, environmental, cultural and place-based benefits is really the sweet spot. That's what we're aiming to do. So why is engagement and impact important for Strathclyde and research intensives more generally? I think perhaps even more so than the academic contribution, it's an impact. It's about, you know, the economic and societal impacts, the contribution that excellent research makes to society, to making society more equitable, to making society fairer. So there's, well, in a kind of nutshell, I would say that, you know, civil society, the third sector, voluntary sector, and the communities that you all work with are of real relevance to the types of research that we care about. There's lots of small pots of money available, and there's lots of interested people in the university. And there's small pots and there's some bigger pots that are available, and that's internal and that's external. And you know, as hopefully it's kind of come across in this discussion, we're really happy to discuss anything. If you've got an idea, we'd happily discuss this with you, with Sally, to see where it can take us. And yeah, sorry, I hope I didn't replicate too much of what other people said there. But you really help us have that social and economic impact that without you we can't have. So I think it's about understanding the value of the voluntary sector and the power that the voluntary sector actually has to shape research and make the world a better place. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that? Anything I've said there? Any points? Any comments? No? Wonderful. Silence. Well, I'm happy to receive any emails. I'll put my email in the address, and you can get in touch with me via Sally as well. So it's kind of just topping up what's been said before there. In terms of so we have discussion, have a breakout room now, and this is about communication strategies and future collaborations. And I think what we're particularly interested in exploring is, if you've got an idea, how would you like to speak to someone at the university about it? How would you like to speak to GCVS about it? What suits you? What suits your organisation? How is it best to approach your organisation or people in your line of work? Do you have any research questions? Any research problems that you'd like to explore? We're really happy to chat about any of that. Any advice you've got, any comments would be very, very welcome. Okay. Fran, are you able to put us in the groups? Yeah.
Just before you do, Fran, I'm just conscious that some people might slip away. We are coming back at the end just to say a thank you and talk about the evaluation form and send out the materials and what have you. So it's just in case anybody slips away straight away from the breakout room, if you could make sure you fill out the evaluation form for us and things. Thank you very much. Thanks, folks. I think it's just myself at the end. Thank you for sticking with us. Hopefully you had a interesting discussion there at the end. We've come up with a couple of good ideas already from our group that we're itching to get involved with, and some potential for something to work together. It's got my head buzzing now, just as the session finishes, thinking about how we can do that and working together. And I met a colleague that I hadn't spoken to in ages, so that's always good, isn't it? So yeah, just to sort of wrap up, please, I think Fran will put in the chat, if she hasn't already, and a link, oh, excuse me, to the evaluation form. It is just our standard GCVS evaluation form, but we think you can still capture in there what you've thought of today, whether you think it's useful. More importantly, if there are other things we could do around about this, and we'll share it with university colleagues. And I wanted to say, as a result of today, Darren and I have already arranged a meeting, and Rose, to pick up anything that comes out of this. So, you know, we're not just having a chat today and then nothing happens. We will follow up with what comes out of today, and also what you put on any of the evaluation forms. So if you can do that, that would be great. And of course the Padlet, which we're leaving open for a bit longer, so that's definitely there. If an idea comes to you on the bus next week, then you've got somewhere that you can pop that. Fran will share all the information as we go along. I think that was all to say from me, other than to say really thanks to my colleagues. I think, is anybody else said, Jenny, you're saying something as well, Jen, at the end, were you? Is anybody else? I can't remember.
I was going to say a few words. Don't worry.
So I just wanted to
Jen wants to as well, though. Jen's very welcome to.
I just wanted to say thank you very much to university colleagues that are here today, and if they could pass on our thanks to Ian and Karen that had to go, and Rose in particular, because this is coming to the end of the piece of research very shortly that she's done, and several of us had met Rose and worked with her. So thank you for being so approachable and talking us through this process, Rose. Thank you very much. Okay, just finally over to Darren then.
Yeah, just a quick thank you for everybody attending. Thanks to Fran for holding this all together, pulling it all together, and being great, and for Sally for their efforts in hosting and coordinating. Massive thanks to Rose. I think Rose got the project up and running very, very quickly, and the work and focus groups point towards what I think is a profound impact on community inequalities. I found the idea about impact rippling up and down the system one that's very persuasive. Funding, short-term, frozen or cut, increased costs, buildings, travel, staff costs, recruitment and retention, leaving for less fulfilling work, services, people accessing with more complex needs, staff being burnt out. It's really bleak stuff, but I think in a way it's a call to action, and it's not acceptable. So we'd be really happy to play our small role in trying to drive change across the sector. So I think, generally, I think the study demonstrates the potential for collaborative work between universities and civil society and GCVS. Really important findings, and there is a number of pertinent questions. And as Sally mentioned, we've got a couple of potentially leads with Maggie with the Community Justice Network, potentially doing brown bag sessions, embedding some of those research findings in more condensed, maybe even slightly less academic ways in plain language to people in the community, and potentially helping apply for innovation vouchers to improve services. So yeah, really, really positive. Thanks so much, everybody. Rose, did you want to have the final word, or anything you want to say?
I mean, just a massive thank you to everyone who's taken part, to everybody who's been here today as well, and particularly to Sally and Fran for their fantastic help in getting this event actually happening. I'm not sure if that had been left to me, it would have run nearly as smoothly as it has. So yeah, thank you so much. And that's it. Yeah.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
And we
Bye,
even
everybody.
managed to finish 10 minutes early, so pop away for lunch. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.